Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on the charity sector adapting post-pandemic. I'm Robbie Anderson, manager of the charity finance team at Altum Consulting. Altum Consulting partners with charities and social enterprises to recruit finance professionals, which puts us in a very privileged position of having daily exposure to leaders across the sector. During the pandemic, we've witnessed the extreme pressures many organisations have been under and spoken to the leaders of those organisations that have had to make tough decisions to best serve their beneficiaries, employees and overall purpose. We've arranged today's event to provide a platform to discuss and debate the future of the sector following the pandemic. We'd like to put your questions to the panel throughout, so please use the Q&A function, which I'll be monitoring, and at appropriate times I'll share questions with Irene, our chair. Please also feel free to use the chat function for any comments or experiences you'd like to share with everyone. When using the chat function, please make sure you have it set to all attendees. I'm excited to introduce Irene Sobowale, who is chairing our panel discussion today. Irene is the CEO of the Disabilities Trust and has been for the past 6 years. We were introduced to Irene by one of our panelists who spoke of her as an inspiring role model who is generous in sharing her values, beliefs, and experiences as a leader with others. And to top it off, in 2019, Irene was awarded the Charity Finance Group Inspiring Financial Leadership Award. So we're certainly in safe hands today. Without further ado, I'll now hand over to Irene. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robbie, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. I almost didn't recognize myself in that description there, Robbie, but thank you. As Robbie says, I am Irene Sobowale, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Disabilities Trust. We're an organisation that offers support for adults with various complex conditions, and it's great to see you all today. I'm really looking forward to our discussions this morning. I'm joined by a great panel of speakers who you can see on your screen, and I will ask each of them to give a brief introduction before we get underway with our discussions. We have an hour and a half this morning, and I'm sure it'll go by really quickly. So I'll start by introducing Caron Bradshaw, who is the Chief Executive of the Charity Finance Group. Caron, over to you.
Thanks, Irene. Yes, so for those of you who don't know who Charity Finance Group are, we're ourselves a charity. We exist to try and support all social change organisations in being as effective and as efficient as they can be. So although charity finance might conjure up in your mind just pure accounting and auditing, it's much more than that. It's everything from pensions and leadership through to other areas of charity finance and funding more broadly. We've also been asked just to say a little bit about how the pandemic has impacted us as organisations. So I guess probably more in common with Sarah's own situation. Oh, I've just had internet connection unstable. I hope you can still hear me.
Caron, we are struggling.
We had our own.
We are struggling a little bit. I wonder if you switch your Wi-Fi, put your video off for a little while, whether that will make any difference.
I will do. Let's see if that makes any difference.
Please do come back in again. When you...
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Super. Okay, so what I was saying is that probably more in common with Sarah than any of the other panelists, CFG being an infrastructure organisation effectively had three lenses through which it had to look at the pandemic. Ourselves as an organisation, as a charity, for our members and how we supported and pivoted our services towards those individual organisations and individuals that needed support, and then our place in the wider sector and how we collaborated with others in order to try and ensure that the sector as a whole was protected and equipped to get through this pandemic. So we really had those three lenses that we were looking at. And certainly we've found the pandemic an incredibly difficult period to navigate financially, operationally, in common with many of you. And I look forward to discussing that with you through this morning.
Thank you very much, Caron. And I have to say, your organisation was certainly very visible through the pandemic and certainly provided useful input for us as a charity. So I hope others found your inputs equally valuable. Could I next call up Chris Locke to introduce himself? Chris is the Chief Executive of the Shaw Trust. Chris.
Thank you, Irene. I just want to start off by saying that it's a real privilege to be on this particular panel, looking at my colleagues. I feel genuinely honoured, so thank you for the opportunity. So I am the CEO of Shaw Trust. I'm 2 years in this month and new to the sector, so this has been quite a steep learning curve for me, and it is a privilege to be with Shaw Trust. Now, Shaw Trust itself is a social enterprise model that has a charity as topco, but also has a foundation which is all about sort of advocacy and driving through some of those longitudinal and lasting improvements that we all want to see in society. So our belief is that a route way to a better life, a route way, not the route way to a better life, is good employment that is meaningful and progressive, and that will also help with social mobility and social equity. So that's our belief, and then the way we get after employability is not just by employability programs, but also we use a child to career framework, because we believe that many of the impediments to good employability or being ready to be employed go way upstream, all the way back to, I mean, we could argue quite comfortably, the evidence points to it, that sort of about -9 months is where some of the impediments and barriers starts to be created. So we have a child to career framework that tries to address some of those elements in an individual's life to try and get them into good employment. And therefore we have several sort of divisions. Some of them might indicate education, learning and skills, including a Mould Academy Trust. Children's Services is quite a significant part of it, including the 10th largest children's homes organisation, where we are passionate about a regulated service that is absolutely Ofsted endorsed and makes a material difference to the children's lives. So that is another aspect of what we do. So quite a complex charity stroke trust stroke social enterprise that is aimed at improving people's lives, and we all know there's enough of that mission for all of us and will be forevermore. So thank you, Irene.
Apologies, first this morning. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you later on in the day. Could I next hand over to Harriet? Harriet, if you could introduce yourself, please, and tell us a little bit about your organisation.
Of course, and it's great to be with you this morning. As Chris says, it's super to be invited onto such a great panel. I'll say a bit about RNID first. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of RNID, and we're the UK-wide charity that's working to make life fully inclusive for everyone who is deaf or who has a hearing loss or tinnitus. We campaign for an inclusive society, we connect people to practical advice and support, and we pioneer new treatments and research into new treatments for hearing loss and tinnitus. My personal journey in lockdown, I've made a recent career change back to the not-for-profit world, having just spent the last 20 odd years as a management consultant. And I made the switch in the middle of the pandemic. So I've seen a whole load of organisations from across literally all sectors in their response to the pandemic. So it's been quite interesting. And I think, Chris, I trump you because you may be 2 years into the sector, but I'm 6 months into my return to the sector. So kind of with that context, without doubt, there are huge challenges for the sector and for those that we represent from the pandemic. I mean, they go without saying, but increased isolation. And actually for our charity, things like, masks for those who rely on lip reading have just created a huge barrier and, further exacerbated inequalities that were there. Chris, you were talking about some of the employment inequalities and education inequalities. And of course, significant financial challenges, whether those are small organisations going under or whether they're just the kind of, the sluggishness of the legacy pipeline with the slowdown of conveyancing, etc. And community fundraising has been massively disrupted by the lack of community events. So without doubt, there's a huge amount of kind of mayhem as a result. But I do think it's really important to look at some of the interesting opportunities that we've got before us as a result of the pandemic. So, I mean, just, obviously there's something about innovation learning through necessity. Just as an example, within RNID, we've, as I'm sure many people on the webinar today we have redesigned services overnight that were purely physical to now be much more remote. So, for example, we're doing hearing aid support through remote drop boxes and actually finding ways to support different people in different ways and more people as a result. So the kind of learning through necessity, I think, has been really interesting. I think there's something about a much greater awareness of the communities around us, because whether it's as organisations or as individuals, we've been kind of stuck in the same place for a while. And I think it's enabled us to understand more about the power and the agency of community groups and communities, whether that's food banks or quite simply, the WhatsApp group in your street. People are making connections that they just weren't making before. And I think the final thing that I'd say is I sense that people are more willing to challenge the status quo than they were. For those of us, and I speak personally here, for those of us who've been born and brought up in the UK, and I recognise that's in many ways a privilege and a sheltered thing. But I think we've experienced something which has been a level of radical change that we haven't experienced before. And I think, having experienced something we couldn't have imagined gives us the sense of a possibility of radical change. And therefore, I think people do challenge constructively and sometimes not constructively in a way that I'm not sure that we had quite the confidence to do before.
Thank you, Harriet. Really interesting thoughts already, and just picking up on the connections and connectivity. And actually, as a sector, we need to think about how we come together and connect more readily. And I think this pandemic probably encourages that. And the challenge, the status quo as well. So I'm really interested to see how that evolves in this conversation and actually how we challenge ourselves as we move forward. I know certainly in my organisation, we're thinking and questioning everything in terms of what we're doing and the ability and option now, almost the permission to actually do things differently. So thank you very much, Harriet. Look forward to hearing more. And the last panelist I'd like to invite, last but not least at all, Sarah Vibert, who is the Interim Chief Exec of the NCVO. Sarah.
Thanks, Irene. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, and thank you everyone for coming to listen. As Irene said, I'm the Interim CEO of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, NCVO. So we're a membership organisation and we've got over 16,000 voluntary organisations in our membership. And those members range from very small volunteer-led community organisations right through to some of the biggest national charities. And I mean, put simply, our mission is to support charities and volunteering. And as you can imagine, that has been hugely important over the last year. NCVO is a charity ourselves, and COVID has had a big impact on our organisation, and that in many ways has mirrored what we've seen in the sector. As you'd expect, we've done an awful lot of work to monitor the impact of COVID on the sector, particularly through a piece of research that we've done with Nottingham Trent University, a monthly kind of temperature check on the sector. And I think through this, we've seen three main areas of impact of the pandemic on charities. Firstly, as you would expect, on their finances. So we've seen 47% of organisations reporting a decrease in income and 35% reporting an increase in expenditure. So you're seeing income going down, expenditure going up because of having to have costs such as PPE, increased technology costs. And we also know that reserves are falling. So in our research, 46% of charities reporting having to access their reserves. The second area of impact is around services. So in parallel to that falling income, we're seeing a huge demand for services in many areas. And we think this is very much likely to continue. I think it was the National Emergencies Trust did some research back in August where they found that 1 in 8 people are expecting to seek help from a charity in the next 12 months due to COVID. Another notable trend has been services shifting online. So 92% of respondents to our monthly barometer reporting that they've moved at least some of their services online over the last year. And then the third area of impact is on people. So people working in charities, we've seen use of furlough, so 9% reporting part-time furlough of their staff and 8% reporting full-time furlough of their staff, and that was in April. So still pretty heavy use of the furlough scheme. Sadly, Pro Bono Economics have estimated that 60,000 people in the sector have been made redundant through the pandemic. That's a pretty big number. And then away from paid staff, volunteering levels, really important impact of the pandemic, and in some ways contrary to what you probably would expect given all the headlines about volunteering and how many people have been volunteering. We've actually seen formal volunteering, so volunteering, for example, for a charity going down during the pandemic, while in parallel the more informal volunteering going up. And also a change in who's volunteering during the pandemic, and some people volunteering for the first time, whereas other people, particularly older people, stepping back. But I think it's important in all of this to know it's been a really mixed picture. Charities have all got different business models, they operate in different subsectors, they're different sizes. And so there's no one kind of typical impact of the pandemic. The charities have been impacted in different ways and to a greater or lesser extent.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. It's interesting hearing you, hearing you going through that list. How many of those items resonate with us as a charity? And I'm sure each of you on the call will, with various elements of what Sarah has just said, will resonate, some areas more so than others. Thank you, everyone, our panelists. We have managed to hit off with a good start, and we are within time. But without much further ado, I will open up then for our panel discussion. And we are starting this morning with Harriet Oppenheimer, who will be talking about surviving and thriving beyond the global pandemic. Harriet has already mentioned some of the things that have happened within her organisation, but Harriet, I would like to hand over to you, and if you can take us through, we'll sit back and listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm just going to provide some sort of opening comments, and I'm sure that my fellow panelists are going to jump in and contribute as well. So I think for me, I mean, it's a massive topic, but I think for me, it's really all about focus. We've already talked a bit, I think most of us have touched on, and Irene, you were talking about it particularly, about the importance of learning and working out what's happened. Like a huge thing has happened to us as organisations, as individuals, as society. And I think we're all grappling with how we react. And I think there's something about how we get the right balance between building on innovations and seeing what's great and kind of knee-jerk reactions. So there's a kind of how do we assess what are the right things to keep and what are the things that, you know, helped us manage in a really difficult time, but actually they're not what we should be doing in the future. As well as my executive role at RNID, I'm also a co-chair of trustees for a large sort of community centre synagogue nursery in North London. We're having a lot of this conversation as well. We're spending a lot of time focused on learning, thinking about what's worked. I think I would say there's a lot of sort of almost concern about making sure that we don't go back to the old normal, we go forward to a new normal, and then we somehow kind of create a space between, you know, as we're coming out of, you know, the restrictions ease and we're able to go back to something more like what we could, making a definite decision to not just go back, but to go forward. And so for me, I think it is all about focus, so that we make sure that the changes that we want are changes that are kind of true to what we're trying to do, that they're in line with our strategy. Because I think it's quite easy to take advantage, to look at some opportunities and say, well, we'll do that because we can, but that's not necessarily something that we should do because we ought to, and it's in line with our strategy. And I think across the sector, I mean, probably across all sectors, but across the sector, I think there are lots of organisations, and we would say ours included, that have a history of struggling because there's been a lack of focus. And we do things because we can, because there's bits of funding to do them, and because there is some need. But that's not the same as having a real clarity that that's the core thing that you should be doing, and that's going to be how you create biggest impact. And I think holding on to that clarity whilst we're in the middle of this kind of learning period, I think is going to be the acid test for a lot of organisations. I'm going to give you a couple of examples from RNID in particular, which I think that they're hugely important to us, but I think they've got a wider application as well across the sector. The first one is around digital. A number of us have already mentioned going online as a huge thing in response to the pandemic. It was part of our plan anyway, but I think we've just been given a massive turbocharged boost to our ability to go online, both for our service users and for our staff. And none of this is to detract from the importance of digital exclusion still as a significant factor that we need to look at. But we can't ignore the significant numbers of more people who have gone online at all ages and in all parts of the excluded and inequalities world, just because it's been the only way for people to connect with people, at all ages. That's how people have been connected with their grandchildren. And that ability for our service users to be online and for our staff to be online, I think it's collapsed what might have been a decade of change and innovation into some months. And I think that the quality of the things that we do online will really stand the test of our success or not. A shameless plug here, RNID launched our new digital service last Monday. So if you want a free hearing check, you can do it in just under 3 minutes. Please do go online and help us check everyone's hearing. So I think digital is going to be huge for everyone. I think the other thing that I would talk about is integrated working, UK-wide working, being able to get the best of your teams wherever they are. So we were already on a journey to try and get more consistency, to try and move away from the postcode lottery of some things being provided some places and not others, and who could do what where. And remote working's just created a huge opportunity to do that. And yes, it's created difficulties and work-life boundaries and some isolation, but overwhelmingly, I've heard people talk about feeling much more integrated. You can be in Scotland and be working with people in Wales and in London, just like this. I mean, I don't know where all of the people on this call are, but my guess is we're probably right the way across the UK. So we've actually made a decision to stick with remote working, and over time, we will be closing our offices. We're not going to move away from face-to-face interactions with people, but we'll have much more targeted, sort of periodic, high-quality face-to-face interactions, because we've decided that actually working like this is a far better way to enable people within the charity to be connected and work productively. And as we've been beginning to open up again, we've had a few hybrid meetings. They aren't nearly as good quality as this because somebody always gets left out. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities. So that's, my starting gambit is digital and integrated working are going to be huge kind of beneficiaries of the changes that we've seen during the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Lots of interesting points within that, and I'm sure lots that we will want to come back to. I think as a sector, we're all going through the same kinds of issues and challenges, and one thing we should perhaps think about is how we share our expertise and learning. So Harriet, I may come back to you a little later on to talk about some of the, as you transition to working remotely, actually what that means for the organisation, how the meetings are working, because we'll all have to deal with similar types of challenges, and actually we should learn from each other. That digital increasing the digital pace and that digital revolution, but also that remote working are really key factors that certainly resonate with me. Do any other members of the panel? Yes, Caron, let's start with you.
I've just pipped you to the post, Sarah, sorry. Hopefully my internet connection's a little bit more stable now. There are a few things that I wanted to add, and I'll try not to sort of duplicate what Harriet said, because I think I endorse everything that she said. I think it resonates with me too. So the things that I wanted to draw out, I think one of the things I've noticed both from within CFG, but also from talking to members, is that during this period of time, there's been a greater permission to fail, to try stuff and not worry too much if it doesn't quite land. But as we emerge from the pandemic, that what we will be prepared to accept during a crisis period is not necessarily what we're going to be prepared to accept when we emerge from it. So somebody sat on the end of their bed with a laptop on their knee might be great and perfectly acceptable during a pandemic, an emergency situation, but once we get out the other side of that, what do we need to then to transition to? So that's one area that I think we probably ought to explore. Collaboration has been a massive thing. The appetite to collaborate, the appetite to be better than the sum of our parts, to come together and to complement and to strengthen and support each other has been something that I have never seen before. I mean, we've all been, I think CFG has always been a collaborative organisation, and I think many people across the sector have collaborated, but that appetite and the pace and the willingness to go further together has been quite immense, and I've been really surprised at that. And then the two other things that I wanted to mention, one is I think that this has given us an opportunity to question what we value. And I think that's the same whether it's our staff and where they want to work, what they feel is important in their lives, the number of individuals that have requested to move out of London, that have requested to be completely home-based and have reconnected with families that they might not have done so during pre-pandemic. But the other side, the flip side and the danger, the last point that I'd make before handing over to Sarah is that I think there is a question and a danger of inequality being exacerbated here. I'm sat in a very comfortable house with an office space, but for some people, office, the workplace is their safe place. And I think we've got to not just think about digital exclusion, but also think about the working lives of those people that we interact with so that we don't end up exacerbating some of the dangers in their lives by removing that safe place to work of the office environment. And I'll pass the baton on.
That's great. Thank you, Caron. I'd just add to that in terms of the inequalities that you're right. Some of us on the call are in positions where we do have suitable office spaces to work from home, but also we've had the prior experience of working within an office environment where we all work together and learning from each other. As our younger colleagues come up through the ranks, we have to think about how we not only integrate them within our organizations and within the world of work, actually, because some of these people are coming straight from university, straight from school, and they have to learn how to integrate and work within that environment. So we need to be very conscious and aware that not everyone has the same opportunities or the same experience, and therefore how do we bring that integration? And I'm sure for some of us it might be a while back, but when you think back to your first jobs and when we first started working, we learned so much from others around us in that physical space. If we no longer have the opportunities for that, what does that mean, and how do we compensate for that? How do we make adjustments to ensure that those positive experiences are not lost? So Sarah, can I hand over to you to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, firstly, I'll just second what Caron said about collaboration. I think that has been an incredible feature of the pandemic. And I think now a lot of those collaborations are getting to the point where they were formed in crisis mode, but they're realizing actually we want to continue this, and what does the future look like? And I think that's really exciting in a sector that I think really kind of thrives when it collaborates. I was just going to build on some of the things that Harriet said about digital. And in terms of NCVO's experience, and I think for us, it's helping us to become a more genuinely national membership organisation, not a London Council of Voluntary Organisations, which is obviously where our office is based. And we own our office, so we don't have plans to kind of, get rid of our office space and things that other charities are thinking of doing. But we're no longer going to be a completely kind of London office-based organisation. And so, I mean, we've seen it in terms of our online training offer, which has just taken off like we could never have imagined. And our AGM last year, which was online, and we had more people turn up than ever before. And it was such a brilliant session. Like, there was such an energy, even though it was online, which was really great to see. And then I think it's also opening up a talent pool for us, in that we're now recruiting any job that we advertise. We're saying it can be London based or it can be home based. And so, I mean, I recently interviewed for a role, and the top 3 candidates were all people who wanted to be home based, not London. And previously they wouldn't have even applied. So I think that's brilliant too. But there's obviously challenges that comes with it. I mean, I think we might touch on this later, but onboarding somebody remotely is a very different thing. And we're going through a really big culture change piece at NCVO at the moment, and developing a shared culture online remotely is a completely different thing to when you're all in the office developing those norms on a kind of day-to-day, day-in, day-out basis. Thank you.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you very much. Lots more added into the mix there in terms of actually how we continue to benefit from the learnings that we've, even within this year and a half, the learnings that we've extracted so far. Chris, do you want to add anything more to this, or can we move on?
I won't add, because everything said was absolutely spot on, and I take great comfort from knowing that we are thinking alike. And we are challenging our organisation the same way. The only point I would make actually to the panel and to all those listening is there is so much concurrent and probably siloed work into all these specific consequences that maybe we need to have a knowledge exchange, especially organisations like ours, which is quite large. We put a fair bit of resource into this, and for the smaller charities in the sector that don't have that flexibility or time to be doing some of the deep thinking, I would be willing to share thinking. So maybe that's something we can think about.
That's a great suggestion, Chris. And I'm sure we will need to think about how we can facilitate that, but that feels like something that we should absolutely be progressing with. Thank you, Chris. Okay, Sarah, can I hand over to you then to pick up on the changing roles of charities and social enterprises?
Absolutely. Thank you, Irene. So I'm going to talk about kind of three different roles, which I think we've seen charities have carried out for years, but we've certainly seen charities carrying out during the pandemic. So firstly, to talk about service delivery. And so clearly charities have had a really critical role in the immediate crisis response. And we, along with our partners in the sector, have talked about charities being never more needed. And I'm not sure that their roles have changed in that respect, but have certainly intensified. So whether it was food distribution, medicine collection, supporting people in relation to loneliness, mental well-being. Another thing that we heard quite a lot from members was the need to provide mobile phone data and other data as a kind of essential service. And we've already talked a lot about digital and indeed digital exclusion and the role charities can play in combating that. Charities have also played a role in indirectly supporting people impacted by the crisis. So, for example, support for people with long-term health conditions when outpatient appointments were cancelled or more difficult to get to at the height of lockdown 1. I think, as we've already seen on the meeting today, the crisis has really shown how innovative and flexible charities can be. So in that sense, the pandemic situation has perhaps played to our strengths, really. Charities have been able to pivot those services and meet new needs, meet ongoing needs. I think some of the service provision through the pandemic has clearly been in addition to the state and the public sector, but clearly one part of charity service delivery is through delivery of public services. And charities have always had an important role to play here, given they offer that local expertise and, really close to communities that they serve. My cat's about to join us. I'll just get rid of my cat. The perils of working from home. So in terms of public service delivery, so during the pandemic, I think we've seen in a lot of areas a really improved relationship between local authorities and the voluntary sector. And it's obviously not universal, but in many areas, we've started to see a much more genuine partnership between charities and local government, rather than charities just being this cheap provider of services. And that's been really encouraging and something that I really hope continues. And clearly the commissioning environment and in particular the funding of local authorities is really important in terms of charities being able to play this role. So the second thing I was going to move on to was the role that charities play in shaping and driving change in society. And Bond recently published a really excellent report in partnership with a number of organisations, including NCVO, about campaigning during the pandemic. And this report includes a lot of really good examples of where charities have worked with people who've been affected by the pandemic, highlighted those problems and suggested solutions, and how they've really creatively engaged media, government and others. So just to give a few examples, so firstly, Women's Aid campaigned for the UK government to fund domestic abuse services and to take action to support women and girls. And so they worked with organisations right across the sector. And then the outcome of that campaign was securing £30 million emergency funding back in April last year as part of that support package for charities. Another example is the campaign Shelter Rang in relation to evictions. They wanted to ensure that nobody would be evicted during the pandemic and preventing landlords from taking renters to court or from physically evicting anyone. And they won that at the end of March when the government made their promise around no one losing their home during COVID. And just to give one more example, I mean, there's so many we could draw on, was the Vibert initiative, the We Need Answers campaign, where they really raised public awareness around the disproportionate impact of COVID on people of colour. And really putting pressure on the government to hold a public inquiry and to take action to address this. The third area I was going to move on to was the role of charities in bringing people and communities together. So I've already talked a little bit about volunteering as part of my introduction, but I think the role of volunteering during the pandemic and the way in which volunteering brought people together, particularly people who otherwise would have been isolated, is really important here. And of course, this is not all about charities, but it is in part about charities. Charities nationally and locally have mobilised volunteers throughout the pandemic, most recently to support the vaccination programme. But of course, we've also seen that rise in more informal volunteering, which isn't necessarily around charities in a formal organisation. I think there's perhaps lessons that charities can learn from the more spontaneous volunteering and what motivated people to get involved. More broadly, in terms of charities, I think the lockdown really shone a light on what society really values, and some things that perhaps are sometimes dismissed as luxuries: theatres, green spaces, choirs, scouts. They're all part of a happy society, and they're all part of the offer of charities. And I think having those things closed and taken away from us during the pandemic has kind of shown how much they are valued. The government is now very focused on its levelling up agenda, and we've heard a lot about physical infrastructure projects, but perhaps less about the sort of social capital, social infrastructure. And I think there's a really important role for charities to play here in terms of their role reducing inequalities, bringing communities together, and coming out of the pandemic. I think this is absolutely essential in terms of charities playing a role in rebuilding and supporting recovery. So, I mean, I know we'll say more on this later, but I think while we're on the topic of the changing role of charities, I do think it's important to note that charities themselves are challenging themselves to change. Clearly, inclusion and equity is intrinsic to a lot of the work of the voluntary sector. But the voluntary sector is not, as we know, always representative of the communities it seeks to serve, and not always reflective of its principles. And I think, you know, COVID has really highlighted and exacerbated those systemic inequalities. And of course, 2020 also saw the tragic death of George Floyd. And I think that's really added the urgency and momentum to the work in the sector on EDI. I'll stop there and let somebody else come in.
Thank you very much, Sarah. There's so much to unpick there and so much that we can talk about, all the way through from supporting people through to the diversity and equality agenda. I'm sure people on the panel will have views and want to make contributions to that. Does anyone want to add to what Sarah has said? Caron.
Yeah, again, in the spirit of not sort of duplicating Sarah's excellent contribution, one of the things that I think has struck me, which isn't necessarily about the changing role of the sector, but rather a recognition of what the role of the sector is how far the government and particularly DCMS have come in recognising that they genuinely don't really understand the roots and branches of how the sector works in its entirety, how it's funded, how the different business models work. And I think that has been something that we have seen shift over the course of the pandemic, and that I hope we can capitalise on. And I don't mean in a manipulative way, but I mean in a way of making social considerations at the heart of decision making is not an afterthought of decision making. And I think that's something that we really collectively have to work on, that has to be beyond just the considerations of our own individual organisations and our own charitable objects, but how we sit within the thriving ecosystem that is civil society in its entirety. So whilst I think there has been perhaps in the past a desire or an impetus, and an understandable one, to only think for the organisation that you support and the charitable objectives that you are delivering, I think that there is now a real visibility of those wider contexts, whether that's environmental change and the absolute imperative that we have as organisations to ensure that we are part of tackling the climate crisis, or whether it's about the cultural piece and how we ensure that people are valued whatever their background is and given equal access and opportunity, and we'll come on to EDI much more later. You know, we are not just islands. This is the other side of the collaboration, is a rising awareness that we have to think beyond just our own charitable and social purposes, and think of ourselves as a healthy, thriving ecosystem to which we contribute more than just our charitable objectives.
Thank you very much, Caron. Building on Sarah's contribution, and actually going back to what Harriet was saying, I think as a sector, it's imperative that we don't allow the broader ecosystem, as you described it, Caron, to go back to the old normal, because you're absolutely right. Never more needed. The value of us as a sector and our contributions was really felt during this period, but it's very easy for people largely to forget that as we move on to other things and other priorities. And we need to make sure that we do keep our flag flying, as it were, in terms of not only our contributions individually, but as you say, Caron, to the broader ecosystem, the value that we bring to the wider world. Thank you very much, both. I'll stop here on that, and we'll move on then and talk about the future CEO. So, Chris, could I hand over to you to begin those conversations?
Thank you, Irene. And can I just say that, you know, I've got a script which I'm going to stick to, because so many of the themes, ideas, and words that I've used appear in my speech. So it almost seems as that we've sort of pre-arranged this. So I'm going to stick with it. And so I think the future CEO, I think this is an absolutely fantastic real world and academic question. And I think it is because it has a paradox at its heart. I think if imagining the future CEO needed to fix today's problem, then we're too late. Today is here. If we are to select the characteristics of the next generation CEO, then what is the future that we are actually planning for? I think this is the paradox. Every time has its unique challenges and requirements that require a set of skills, experience, and character to deal with the detail. But the future remains unknowable in detail unless you have the foresight of hindsight or happen to be a time traveler. So on that, but you can get lucky. So between 2004 and 2005, I was teaching an elective at university on uncertainty and chaos, how to understand it, prepare for it, and succeed in it. And I have built on this in my leadership career over the last 15 years leading up to COVID-19. However, had I been prepared for the challenge, or did the challenge come to me? Are leaders pre-made, or does context and circumstance tap us on the shoulder? I have often wondered how many political, military, civic society and industry captains there have not been because opportunity rather than skill eluded them. So how do we spot them, and how do we incubate and nurture them? If history is a guide, what are we looking for? No one predicted 9/11, the global financial crash of 2008, and COVID-19, all devastating, all adding to the sum of human misery, all requiring reflection, transformation, and a new leadership style. However, I would argue that obscene acts of terrorism, financial crashes, and rampaging disease have been predicted for centuries. I will go on the record now as predicting more to come. History is a guide in what is required from future CEOs in general, but not specifically. I believe that the current crisis has torn down the ruling paradigm, accelerating momentum from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, including, importantly, our responsibility to our home planet Earth. But also, it has tested the sector's preferred operating model and comfort. Structures, processes, rules, and certainty have fallen by the wayside. Successful, and I do challenge how do you define success at this early stage, CEOs have not anchored themselves to the old paradigm. So CEOs need to rest comfortably with uncertainty, imperfect information, multiple futures, reduced and highly competed for resources, and an overwhelming demand on their organization to act with certainty. CEOs today have to navigate paradoxes and contradictions, thinking not only about their enterprise, but also how they would contribute to a healthy ecosystem for all to benefit. Today's CEO must elevate their mindset to view and shape the environment beyond the enterprise and take a sector and increasingly and necessarily a global perspective. So CEOs have to be able to hold in their mind's eye the macro environment as they define and cleave to their core purpose, really important, core purpose. They must shape simple strategies that all can instantly understand and co-own. They must set clear goals, the what, without prescribing the how. If you do that, that kills innovation and saps engagement. And so therefore the CEO's role is to chase the vision, not the detail, even though the CEOs know that the devil has not actually changed address. They must also inspire others with confidence, purpose, values, while seeking expertise and emotional intelligence today. We have to build organizational robustness, resilience, and energy in all, and create a culture of curiosity and learning to meet the needs going forward. So I think the task of the CEO is to create and empower talented people who understand the importance of embracing ambiguity, who learn new things quickly, and if necessary, unlearn them just as fast. People who can move seamlessly and easily between new and different challenges, and yet embrace the vision and the mission. I think the CEO's role is to create the diverse team of talent that will, in fact, do the heavy lifting, translating ideas, experience, experimentation into better outcomes, and able to continuously co-evolve as a response to the changing environment, both at the macro and the micro level. So I think an agile and adaptable workforce is a believing one, an empowered one, and a diverse one. It also must be curious and learning. This is where the CEO accepts that with learning and adaptation, mistakes will occur, but they must create an environment where the error is not to push for progress and better outcomes. It's not to punish the error when pushing for better progress and better outcomes. The CEO must set the parameters to prevent these errors of learning and adaptation from being lethal rather than not occurring. So a purpose and mission-led organization always favors function over form, and that is quite challenging for many organizations. So leadership today is not about reducing risk and complexity. You can't. Leadership today is about change, transformation, a relentless pursuit of mission and purpose while holding tight to your values and the vision of the better future you want to create. To achieve this requires accounting for the needs, desires, and hopes and ambitions of all stakeholders. And balancing stakeholder priorities requires a CEO who is a collaborator, mentor, arbitrator, and ultimately the responsible officer. It requires an ability to weigh those competing needs as equal and important, yet make the tough calls when required. There will always be competing demands and priorities that will always overmatch resource. In addition, actions need communicating with integrity, honesty, and transparency. That is in itself an enormous task, which needs to be another key strength of future CEOs. Communicating to the stakeholder community is never finished. It needs to be, in my opinion, a wave-like function, ripples in the pond, and the CEO needs to hear the echo. CEOs must create a listening infrastructure to understand what employees are thinking and feeling, especially in the world of remote and hybrid working. With so many of us adopting remote working, the challenge of communication, quality, and effectiveness on leadership is greater. Leadership needs to articulate in ways that provide clear signals to everyone in terms of what they should be working on and why it is important. listening has to be upgraded to an enterprise-wide culture, and it has to be two ways. I think the pandemic has focused CEOs' minds on a great many things, but high on the list is, of course, the well-being of our people and the importance of maintaining a tightly knit workforce that is still bonded by culture, shared sense of ownership and responsibility, despite hybrid or remote working models, a real challenge for any CEO. And we have seen again and again that the adaptability, resolve and creative problem solving of our people has been the key to success. CEOs are more concerned than ever and should be about the well-being of their teams, a concern no doubt exacerbated by less interaction due to the lockdowns. So today's CEO must collaborate and build capacity in their people. I will finish by returning to my opening premise that the future is unknowable in detail. It'd be foolish to think otherwise and to plan otherwise. The specific characteristics and traits required by the CEO for a future context and contingency is therefore unknowable. What we do know is that paradigm shift and change is endemic. The CEO's responsibility today for the future is to grow a pool of talent that is expert in their immediate tasks, yet can situate, test and evaluate their actions at the enterprise level, who are comfortable with ambiguity and treat it as an opportunity to progress, curious, questioning and jealously guarding of their co-ownership and co-responsibility for the mission, always ready and able to step one level up and think two levels up, and who view and embrace all human talent, whatever their background, as the vital element for success. I'll stop there.
Wow. Thank you very much, Chris. Do you know, wow, just sums up how I feel after that. I started making notes as you were writing and I stopped halfway because so much of what you said actually is relevant for all of us. I also felt, wow, I've got a lot more to do, a lot more to add to my to-do list in terms of my day-to-day responsibilities and actually things that I focus on and think about. Can I ask Christopher, if you don't mind, I'd like if you could share that with us as part of the outputs from this. I think I personally, and I suspect a few people on the call will probably benefit from being able to reflect over and rethink about some of the points you made, because I thought all of that was really, really very relevant. Thank you. Sarah, would you like to add to that? And then I'll come to you, Harriet, next.
Actually, I think Harriet was first. Let Harriet go first.
Sorry, I didn't see you waving. You should have been more prolific. Harriet, let's start with you then.
How very collaborative of you, Sarah. I was just going to make a point that I actually think that for the future CEOs, I think the pandemic has been a huge boon, actually, because we've created a cadre of leaders who have been through some seismic change. And if I think back to my consulting days, when I used to work with all sorts of clients, taking them through big change, big new strategies, restructurings, it was always clear that it was quite dangerous to have top teams who were composed of leaders who had always run something in a steady state world. But it's actually not always easy to get that experience of change. And like we as a sector, as a society, as a world, we've got a cadre of people who have become leaders through change without knowing that they were going to become it. And I can't help but think that that's going to make a really positive difference to the quality of our CEOs for the future. I think what our CEOs are CEO of is another matter. There's a number, I mean, Sarah, Caron, you were talking about ecosystems. Chris, you were talking, we've all talked about collaborations beyond the organization. So whether we're going to be CEOs of organizations or of movements or of ecosystems or even of cause, there's something about kind of what's the ownership or the legitimacy of the kind of collective thing that we represent. But I think that there's some real excitement for me about what will come out of the generation who have experienced this as a kind of growth development experience.
Yes. Thank you, Harriet. That's a really, really relevant point, because we've all lived through the pandemic and gone through our personal experiences, our organizational changes, all of the things that we've needed to adapt to. And now we accept that as a normal. We are much more open to change, to adaptability, to agility, to creativity, to innovation, because we have to be. And actually having that as a starting point in terms of our basic thought processes has to be beneficial. So that's a really, really interesting point. Thank you, Harriet. Can I come over to you now, Sarah?
Thanks, Irene. And I really enjoyed listening to that, Chris. Thank you. The one thing I did want to add to what you said was actually around, you talked a lot about needing to look after staff wellbeing, but I think there's also something about CEOs being able to look after their own wellbeing. And obviously part of it's about building resilience. I mean, in your list were things like being comfortable with uncertainty, reduced resources, all those things. I mean, the chief execs I've spoken to all say that the last year has been the most stressful, most challenging of their whole career. And as Harriet says, that's great because there's all this change management experience. But I do worry about the well-being of chief execs in the sector, and I don't think that's going to get any easier. I mean, two brilliant articles that if participants haven't read them, I really recommend. One, Sophie Parker wrote a really good article about the dysfunctional working culture in civil society and the need for leaders who are creative and imaginative, and that you can't do that if you're burnt out. And then different subject, but same sort of theme. Becky Hewitt wrote about the need for more flexible working in senior roles in the sector. And both those articles really spoke to me, and I know spoke to lots of leaders in the sector. So I think there's just something really important around, firstly, how we build resilience of CEOs, but also how we as a sector support CEOs. And clearly there's a role for organisations like NCVO and Akivo, but I think also for all boards and all leadership teams to not only support the wellbeing of staff, but to also make sure that leaders are kind of able to find that balance themselves.
Yeah, that's a really valid point, Sarah. Thank you. I can see Karen's itching to jump in. So Karen, I'll let you speak.
Thank you. And just one last thing that I wanted to add, and I think this is amplifying what's been said already. We've often thought about improvisation being what you do when the plan doesn't work. And I think what for me has been this profound shift has been a recognition that improvisation is freedom within structure. So our planning still needs to be there, but our planning needs to be about the structure of the things that we can do and respond to risk. As Chris absolutely said, you can't eradicate risk. Risk is part of life. And all we should be doing is trying to navigate our lives in a better way, to navigate that risk in a more healthy and sustainable way. So for me, it is that improvisation. It's the ability to apply your thinking to a future state and to be able to take a step, the biggest step that you can take right now with what you've got, using all the resources available to you. To be able to be resilient doesn't mean that you are tooled up. It means that you are able to absorb and roll with the punches, but also to be able to, as Sarah said, really focus in when you put your own mask on, because like the airplane, the reason they tell you to put your mask on first before helping someone else is because you can't help someone else if you're passed out in the aisle. So I think those are really brilliant points that were made by other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think the panel have all made really, really relevant points. And I think one of the key takeaways about uncertainty being the new normal, and we just have to learn and put in place whatever we need to respond in that way, because that is the way that is our new normal. Chris, I'll let you make one final point.
Can I just say thank you for those brilliant responses, and I could add examples to everything that you were saying. I mean, Clausewitz wrote in the 19th century that the first responsibility of a leader is to ensure that they were fit to lead. So I think you're absolutely right. And I note this morning that Bill Gates frequently takes what he calls think weeks, where he vanishes for a week with no phones, no connections, in order to think about the organisation. So I'm not sure we're going to get away with think weeks, but the point is really clear. Just one thing on what you said, that uncertainty is the new normal. I think my point is that uncertainty is always the normal and always has been. But what the tendency for humans and their need for certainty is to create stability that doesn't exist, and therefore to be perturbated by it when it fails. So I think there is something about creating people who are comfortable with understanding and then acting in the true environment. I think that then opens them up for opportunity, opens them up for progress. So it's not the new normal, it is the normal. And I think that is what That's what makes us uncomfortable. And also there is this other thing, hedonistic adaptation. As soon as you settle into a new norm, then that becomes the only thing you're comfortable with. We just need to be careful of that too.
Yeah.
But we've got some great youngsters. I've had some youngsters and some juniors who have absolutely risen to the occasion. They have proved themselves. And history tells us that the old guard are often not fit for the crisis of the moment. And I will use my military experience just to point out that by the time we got to Christmas 1914, World War I, starting in August, something like 40 to 50% of the leadership were either burnt out or fired because they were not competent for the new context. How prepared are we to look at talent that meets the need and advance them and empower them and to give them the permissions? I think that's a really important question.
I couldn't agree more, Chris, and I stand corrected. It is the normal. It absolutely is. It just feels like it's been accelerated, and it's expected now, and we need to more openly recognize that it just is. That's the way of the world. Okay, Caron, lastly, but by no means least, can we talk about equality, diversity and inclusion? I'll hand over to you to start, and I'm sure others will have contributions to make as well.
Thank you. So my opening remarks really aren't going to give you all the answers. It's just some reflections on what I've noticed, and certainly over the decade plus that I've been at CFG, we've been talking about equality or diversity and or inclusion and or EDI. But over that period of time, the conversations have not been matched by the actions. You know, I haven't seen the progression over that 10 years at the rate that I think that our people deserve. And if anything positive can come from the trauma and the experiences that we've witnessed during the course of this year, I hope that it has been a shot in the arm to really push us forward to act collectively and individually in these areas of inclusion and equality. What I think this has also has happened over the last year is a massive increased awareness and an increased agency to speak up and say, I don't like what I'm experiencing. And I challenge, I think this is echoing the comments that were made earlier, I challenge the status quo. I'm not prepared to carry on accepting the environment that I have hitherto been working within. So I think there's a real shot in the arm for that. More people are taking this seriously because we're witnessing the fallout that can happen to us individually and organisationally if we get this wrong. But we also can witness the personal cost and the ways in which our individual members of staff have been negatively impacted by the things that they've witnessed across the sector. More organisations are putting things in place. And I think that we have for many years been saying, well, if we make things much easier for specific groups, we all benefit. And we've all recognised that the decisions that are made with diverse voices around the table are better decisions. But those words, as I say, have not necessarily been matched by actions. One of the things that I thought when I was reflecting on what I might say this morning was on the words of Lynn Berry when she opened our CFG conference a few years back. We'd asked her to talk about how do you empower people? And her opening comment was really to say that was the wrong question. We shouldn't be asking what we do to empower others, but rather what is it that we do that takes away that disempowers them, that puts barriers in their place, that doesn't give them agency, that doesn't enable them, as Christopher was saying about the people that we haven't seen that come forward. How many of those brilliant people have we missed over the years through not recognising the barriers that are in their way that prevent them from seizing opportunity? So I think we do have to focus on how we create safe environments, how we spot people that have not been, and I use the word advisedly, groomed for future leadership. How do we ensure that we play to people's strengths, not try and squeeze them into JDs and boxes that we think are appropriate for a particular role or job? And in the digital environment that we're currently living in, a couple of notes of caution. How do we ensure that the visibility of bad practice and bad behaviour doesn't become invisible, that we don't miss stuff that we would otherwise see in office? I don't know about you, but I was very reliant on my ability to walk into a room and feel an energy about what was going on. And I've been stripped of that in the digital environment. I don't feel that in the same way that I did before. So am I missing microaggressions or behaviours that are disempowering my staff? And how am I going to switch that if we're not going to all be in the same place at the same time? How do we ensure that we learn quickly from the experiences that our staff remind us of? And I think to just go back to the future CEO piece, one of the things that I think has been an incredible learning for me over the last few years is that ability to listen, to understand where someone's coming from, and also to receive feedback and recognise that sometimes the feedback comes to you packaged in a really unpleasant way, and that we mustn't discount what people are saying. We've got to find the diamonds in the dirt. We've got to not respond to what might be a very hurtful sharing of an experience, because hurt people will hurt people. And therefore we've got to not discount what people say. So I thought I'd just end by sharing a couple of things that CFG have done over the years. We no longer require degrees of our staff unless we think this is something that specifically requires a professional qualification, and then it's given as an indication. So for example, a financial role, do you need to be a member of a professional body? Or is that a very good quality piece of evidence that shows you that somebody has reached a certain level? And could you otherwise be demonstrating your ability to deliver those services through other means? And I think we need to open our minds as to what are essential job requirements. We focus on people, not just their CV and their experience, but rather what can they bring to the organisation and how might they be able to bring the best out in other people. We ensure that our interviews are not just top down, they're peer-to-peer, they're external users as well that talk to our staff to see what they can bring. We're platforming great people. We're trying to give them speaking slots. We're trying to advocate them, offer them bursaries, bring them on board. If somebody in a membership organisation is up for an election, for example, will people vote for them if they haven't seen them in another environment? So what role can we play in giving people the moment in the spotlight that gives them that opportunity and recognition? And we've also used things like bursaries and things like that. So I'll stop there and let the others come in with some thoughts of their own.
Thank you very much, Caron. Lots there to think about, and lots of questions that we need to be thinking about for ourselves and our organisations, and thinking about answers to those questions as well. Would anybody like to come in? Chris.
Thank you, Irene. So, Caron, I think that's absolutely brilliant, and there's so much to build on that, and I think we could probably talk about for the next 3 hours on it. But the whole EDI bit is about talent, it's about acknowledgement, it's about recognition, it's about removing barriers, obstacles, deliberate and hidden, and I think it leads to an exciting future. But what we have seen, and you're quite right, is that a simple statement of intent is absolutely woefully insufficient. So I think, and we all have to be cautious because of law and regulation, but there has to be a positive approach to making this happen. We now are a generation that are responsible for accelerating this rather than just keep saying the same thing over and over again. And I think we need to all really embed mentoring models and diverse groups and structures within our organizations where voices can be heard and cross-referenced, and we can be held open to challenge. It's about also being honest about uncomfortable truths as well, and these work both ways, where I am quite rightly and legitimately challenged on diversity numbers, ratios, but I will challenge back on talent and competencies and experience, which can only be built from a diverse, truly diverse workforce and their ability to give voice to the problem and the opportunities that we want. So it's not confusing one thing for another is the critical thing, because otherwise I think the danger is that it just becomes a tick box exercise. It just becomes glib and meaningless. And actually what you do is you set those people up for failure rather than success. So I would much rather that we created a learning culture and environment where people can grow and bring their ideas to the table, I think that's the way to bringing talent up and through the organisation. And I'm really excited about some of the diverse talent that we've got. And they're all, well, I think they're all youngsters. They're all youngsters and they're all great. And all those that we have done sort of interventions, whether it's through CEO shadow days, whether it's through other such things, they've all been promoted since. And the only reason how is that we've given them an opportunity. And I think that relates back to my previous one. How many have not because they weren't given the opportunity? So I completely agree with everything you say, Caron. I think it's really exciting that for once we can see beyond the boundaries of diversity and actually see no boundaries at all. I think that's where we need to get to.
Great contribution, Chris. Thank you very much. Do any of the other panelists have anything to add? Sarah?
Yeah, I don't have very much to add to what Caron and Chris have said, which I think has been really articulate on this. But NCVO as an organisation has obviously been on a very public journey in relation to EDI progress. And I've certainly, as a kind of individual, as a leader, been on a similar journey over the last kind of 18 months and year. And I think, the main learning, I think, for us as an organisation, but also for me as an individual, is basically what it all comes down to is about power and shifting power. So, as a membership body, as NCVO, one of the things we've been trying to do through our new strategy is think about how do we really kind of put the power with the members, rather than it being about NCVO as the body. It's about the members, which are the 16,000 organisations that are the real strength of the organisation. And how can NCVO act as that kind of convener? And, as Caron talked about, how do we kind of platform people, give people a voice, open doors, etc. But then, then obviously there's a huge piece for us to do internally as an organisation as well, which is very much around shifting the culture. That obviously touches everything from how do we make decisions to how do we recruit. Chris talked a lot about giving people opportunities.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I was sitting back ready to hear more, because it's you're right. Excuse me. When we talk about EDI, it is really about culture and that shift of culture. It isn't a tick list. It's not a series of things you do and then it's done. It is about shifting the culture, shifting thought processes, shifting how we look at things, and making sure that we consciously, at this point, it's a conscious attention and a conscious focus to try and get to the point where actually it becomes so embedded that you don't have to think about it and it's just part of what we do. So it's great to hear your contribution. Sarah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that based on what you said. I think our new head of people and culture, who is coordinating a lot of our kind of culture change roadmap, just keeps saying to me, there is no end point. This is forever now. And, this relentless focus on culture, which I think is a really important way to conceptualize it, really.
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Sarah. Harriet?
I was just going to add briefly, because I think we'll want to move on. Everything that people have said have resonates. There's something that you said, Caron, at the beginning about the pace of change hasn't matched what people have said, and maybe I'm sort of opening a bit of a can of worms here, but I don't disagree at all. I wholeheartedly agree. At the same time as that, culture isn't something that changes overnight, and there's something that we've got to get the balance right with as we talk about establishments, big structures, organisations, societies, cultures. It goes back to something that you said, Chris, about how we make this not become a tick box thing. The easiest, quickest things to do are the things that don't stick. So we need to challenge ourselves, and we need to want pace. And none of this is being an apologist for not enough happening. But I think we need to have an honesty and a kind of courageousness to acknowledge the things which take longer, because my concern is that when we focus on pace over sustainability of culture change, actually it damages the cause, very much as you were talking about, Chris, the honesty about diversity balanced with capability, and it's difficult to have those conversations, because the whole area is really fraught. But I think there's something about acknowledging that where the strategy is the right strategy and the intent is the right one and the culture is changing, even if it's slower over time that we might want, that may lead to more sustainable results over time.
Yeah. Thank you, Harriet. I can see you bursting to get in, Caron. I will let you come in. I think the point you make, Harriet, is actually really well made. And I suspect most of us in the room want to see these changes immediately or certainly in the very short term, and actually accepting that actually change takes, as you said, cultural change takes a while, and actually recognizing it's not just being able to tick off those boxes, but actually seeing this evolve is really important. Caron, I'll let you speak on this, and then we have to go to questions, otherwise we'll run out of time.
I think you're so right, Harriet, about the pace and it not being doing things quickly because you can. But what I would say, and this goes very much to what Chris was saying about the role of a CEO, I think we have to let go of the things we found comfort in. We found comfort in being able to say, well, we've had a meeting, we've had a conversation, we've put things in place, and we've not necessarily stood back and said, is it making a difference? What is the lived experience on the front line? What is the lived experience of the people that we are trying to give agency to and open up opportunity to? Rather than sticking with those measures and the things in which we have had comfort and we can say we've done. I honestly don't believe that for the vast majority of people, the intent has just been to tick a box, to shift the conversation away from having to just do the, I've done this, look at me, aren't I good, tick box. I think it is genuinely be an intent to try and change things. But we've also, I think, been habitually listening to reply and not listening to understand. And I think that's where the real change will come, when we stop trying to just respond and defend ourselves and actually really listen to what people need, not what we think they need.
Yeah, really, really valid points, Caron. And there's so much that we can be said about that, and recognizing that it's we all want to do the right thing. We all want to make sure that we make these changes, but to stand back, to take time to stand back and reflect, is it really achieving the outcomes? Not ticking those boxes, but is it delivering the outcomes that we are so desperately trying to achieve? Chris, go on, Chris. I can't say.
I just want to build on what Caron said, because I think it's really important. She said we don't often ask ourselves, is it making a difference? I think a precursor question that we don't ask ourselves enough as CEOs and as seniors is, what is actually happening? We don't really pause and say, what is actually happening? And then test everything against that. And I think Black Lives Matter the terrible tragedy that last year with Floyd, and everything flows. The question, I think, wasn't asked enough about what is actually happening, to get really underneath it, rather than just, there was a massive urge to just respond and to genuflex and do all that sort of thing, which might not have been the right answer. So I think, the questions, I think it's one of the important responsibilities of CEOs and future CEOs is asking the right questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And I will stop there so we can actually take time to answer some of the specific questions we've been asked. Thank you to all of you on the line. Thank you for your patience, but these are really important conversations. Now, we had 4 questions sent in to us before we started this webinar. I'll try and get to those, and then if we have time, come on to the questions on the that have been asked here today. I won't go into, I think panelists have got the full questions, but I'll start off with the first question, and I'll point that to you, Chris, and that's talking about how we embrace neurodiversity and how we ensure that we collaborate to achieve this, what steps we need to ensure equality of access and opportunity for individuals who are neurodiverse.
Thank you, Aaron. I completely forgot there were some pre-posed questions. But that's a great question, and I think it actually speaks to what we've just been talking about. Neurodiversity is diversity, and therefore, we need to be as open to it as we are to all the other aspects of diversity, and not to build in artificial boundaries and barriers, which are also about conception and misconception. But at the same, and therefore we do see increasingly from neurodiversity, from all sorts of across the spectrum in so many ways. We see companies across the world using some very diverse, neurodiverse people because of their unique insights and approaches and skills, which within society in general can be seen as being different, but actually, if you put that skill to good use, is really, really valuable. It's valuable to the individual, but valuable to the organization. The only thing I would be worried about, though, is again not turning it into, and I'm trying to be cautious with my words. Is that you mustn't turn that into some sort of exhibition. Look at the neurodiverse. It is about normalizing neurodiversity as we normalize sexuality, as we normalize so many aspects of diversity. And I think it's an area, and I know there's a lot of we've got some great partners in our supply chain, and I ought to, perhaps I should drop a mention, I don't know, but we've got some great people who work on neurodiversity, and what we see time and time again is that they're able to unlock talent, unlock contributions, which adds to the social good. So as far as neurodiversity is concerned, is that we've always had neurodiverse people. Oftentimes we don't recognise it, but when we do recognise it, is don't treat it as some sort of, I don't know, don't treat it as a freak show that you're going to be seen to be doing something about. These are real people with real talents. The problem is us and our own bounded reality. And that is true of all diversity. How do you break that bounded reality?
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm not going to take any more discussion on that. I want to move on to answer some of the other questions that have been posed both today in the room and previously. There was a question about how recruiting staff during the pandemic and working remotely, how that works and how we can facilitate that and thoughts around that. And in the room today, we've also had an extension of that question, talking about how possible hybrid working can how we support the younger generation, how we pick up on taking care of people and disadvantaged groups. Harriet, I was going to start with you because I know you have actually started this process within your organisation. So perhaps you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I'm really happy to. And I'm not going to remotely pretend that we've got all of the answers yet, because I think that this is a journey. I suppose I'm going to make a sort of few comments, and I'm not going to pretend that they're all in a nice, neat list that come to a conclusion. I think one thing I'd say, which is about onboarding people and kind of inclusion, it's age related, but it's also inequalities related. I think, Sarah, you mentioned something about this earlier. We believe that by accessing a UK-wide labour market, we're actually going to be able to reach a far greater diversity of people. That's not, I mean, that's part of that's geographic representations. Part of it is hard to reach groups, communities that don't necessarily live particularly close to, public transport or means of getting places. So I think that actually the outreach potential of remote working is enormous. I do, however, think that we need to think of it as something that's completely different. So you're right, onboarding as a function is something we need to think about, but I think we need to completely reimagine it. I think it's, in the same way that good digital experience is not just taking your, analog paper-based information and sticking it online, it's completely redesigning it. I think we need to redesign, onboarding as well. Chris gave some great examples earlier of the sorts of things that we can do to mentor, provide shadowing opportunities. I don't see why any of those are not available to people online. And in fact, I'm going to slightly take the liberty of expanding into another question that I saw coming online about how do you create culture and change culture when you're doing it remotely because it's easier in the office. I'm going to challenge that. I think it has been easier in the office because we've been in offices, but I think that the possibility of real access to visible, authentic leadership that is created by this kind of, nakedness of talking into the screen with tens or hundreds of people around you. I've been doing all staff meetings a lot since I joined, and I'm frequently on a call with nearly 200 people, talking to them about plans for the future charity. I don't think people had those opportunities before. So I think it completely needs to be reimagined and redesigned. I don't think that we can assume that you can take something analog, put it online and say it now works. And we're going to have to invest time in it. But I think the possibilities are really significant. And I think the other thing that I'd say is that we have made the decision that over time we're going to be closing our offices and be home working by default. But that doesn't mean to say that we're never going to be meeting face to face. I think it means that we also need to reimagine and redesign what our face to face in-person work experiences are there for. Maybe it's actually not our routine business as usual meetings, the kind of quarterly review meetings of this, that and the other. Maybe it's a mixture of times when we're doing real workshopping to imagine the future and that kind of inspirational, how do we all get our ideas together, brainstorming stuff, and also some structured downtime so that we enable people to be together when there isn't an agenda, when they are just in the same space, building some of those connections so that they build those relationships. I think that's all up for play. I think the only rule is we have to assume that it isn't just what it was, but online.
Great, thank you very much, Harriet. There's so much to say, and I feel now I failed woefully in my job as chair, as we haven't been able to address as many of the questions as I had hoped to address, but we've had such a meaningful conversation, such useful conversations. I will hand over to Robbie in a minute to talk about actually how can we respond to some of the further questions that have been asked, if there's an opportunity to do that, but also how we continue some of these conversations, because I hopefully you've all got out of it as much as I certainly have today. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface and begun to dig into some of these topics, and there's so much more that can be done. I'm not sure how we'll do that. I will hand that particular problem over to Robbie to think about how we can take that forward. But I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. It's been a great conversation today, great contributions. I could spend another 3 or 4 hours talking to you, each of you, to dig in a little bit more. But we've completely run out of time. So Robbie, can I hand over to you to wrap up? But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Irene, and you haven't failed woefully in any element of your chairing the event today. You've been brilliant, as has everyone, so thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. As a thank you to each of our speakers, we'll be making a donation to a charity of their choice. And for anyone that would like a recording of today's discussion, please contact Emma Winsey, our marketing manager, or me. We'll also, if you've got any further questions or anything like that, we'll share them with the panel and chair as well, and do a follow-up email with any answers that we receive for those. We're planning in future to hold other discussions similarly pertinent to the charity sector. So please also get in touch if you have any feedback on today's session, or you'd like to be involved as a panelist or audience member in a future discussion, or if you have any suggestions as to topics you'd like covered. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely bank holiday.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, everyone. And yes, have a great weekend. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Irene. Thanks all. Bye-bye.